I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
The people alive now are the generation to come. Will look at this conference and consider one thing. Did that number stop rising and start to drop as a result of commitments made here?
This week saw the start of the seminal COP26 conference in Glasgow, Scotland. As scientists warn of the danger of not cutting carbon emissions by 2030, countries from around the world are racing against the clock to reverse the potentially catastrophic effects of climate change before it's too late. Joining me today is Olivia Lazard, a visiting scholar with Carnegie Europe who focuses on the geopolitics of climate. We'll unpack what's happening on the ground at COP26 and how the EU will be a leader on climate action. Here we go. Olivia, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm a little nervous about this conversation because climate is such an important topic in which so little progress seems to be made, but hopefully you can help us unpack all of those issues.
I hope so.
Before we dive in, Olivia, just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm a visiting scholar with Carnegie Europe, and I focus on geopolitics intersecting with climate disruptions and climate transitions. And interestingly, I don't come to climate change and geopolitics from a very traditional background of climate policy. For over 12 or 14 years, I was actually working in conflict and fragile zones. And it's in those areas that I actually saw how little we were doing when it came to environmental destruction and climate disruptions, and how much we could do to try and make our climate transitions a lot more coherent and a lot more systemic, which is now why I'm working with Carnegie to try and sort of spread the good word.
Your own experience is actually kind of interesting because when I was growing up, climate was sort of its own self-contained area of study. And now, like you said, conflict and migration and so many issues touch climate. And I know a lot of that will be on display at COP26. I know you're going there this week. But you probably are already talking to people who are on the ground. So, it's just kicked off as the recording of this podcast. So what's the mood like? What are you hearing from people who are there, and what are you expecting as you prepare to go?
So this COP is quite particular. It's different from other COPs that have been taking place in the past. And the reason for it is actually because it's a direct link to what happened in Paris 6 years ago with COP21, where the Paris Agreement was essentially set to ensure that collectively every country would set some plans in terms of transition to curb global warming under 2 degrees and preferably towards 1.5. Today at COP26, we're seeing the first COP, which is about really assessing, are we on track to curbing, global warming under 2 degrees? And again, very much sort of trying to see if we can reach 1.5, because the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the summer was essentially saying that 1.5 degree increase of temperatures compared to pre-industrial levels is the absolute maximum that we can reach in order to avoid climate runaway scenarios. So the mood at the moment is uncertain because the latest reports before the start of COP26 demonstrate that for all of the efforts and for all of the pledges that we've seen this year in terms of ratcheting up ambitions, we're still on path essentially to have a 2.7 degrees Celsius increase compared to pre-industrial levels.
So, okay, let's return to sort of the top line here. There's 2 notable leaders who are not attending. That's President Putin of Russia and President Xi of China. Can you tell us a little bit about what your read is that they aren't attending? And I know both of them are doing some things virtually, but that's not quite the same as being there in person.
It's not. So there are different ways to read the situation. One is that COPs in climate negotiations have very often been associated with Western countries or rule of law abiding countries trying to push for more climate ambitions. And this particular COP, you see the return of the United States after President Trump had pulled out of the Paris Agreement. President Biden, for the past year or so, has been really trying to step up to the plate to put climate first within its own, within the government's sort of 360 policy agenda, and to push for a new U.S. leadership within climate negotiations. On this, obviously, the US finds usual partners such as the European Union, which is very happy for the US to be back, but also looks at the US with some concern as to the type of, political instability at home, which may derail, climate ambitions. And China and Russia have been playing essentially on the optics of US leadership and not coming to COP26, which is one where the US returns and where the US wants to lead the conversation and wants to really sort of push for larger ambitions at a collective and global level, is a sign of undercutting US leadership, and more generally to try and undercut, this narrative of COP and climate negotiations as associated with rule of law abiding countries. Because as it so happens, even though China is not, or President Xi Jinping is not taking part personally in COP26, he is sending his envoy, who is the equivalent of John Kerry within the government. So China still has a lot of presence. And on top of it, China has been consistently actually ratcheting up its own ambitions since the UN General Assembly of 2020, where it announced that it wanted to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. And since then, it has regularly, given a lot of information, some critical information, as to how it is planning its own transition, but also how it is planning to help a global transition. And so to a certain extent, President Xi Jinping not showing up and still being able to demonstrate stable, credible leadership is another sort of peak within the way in which the US and the EU are trying to really lead the conversation forward.
Okay, so what about Putin?
For President Putin, it's a bit of a different dynamic, even though it does, sort of play within this entire narrative and perspective of trying to undercut US and European leaderships on climate conversations, but also rule of law in general and multilateralism. For President Putin, there is a sense also of trying to play now geopolitical theatrics around climate policy. And what I mean by that is essentially that President Putin has been very passive when it came to climate conversations for the last more than a decade, actually. And all of a sudden, over the last few months, we've seen quite a regain in interest, or an uptake in interest, also because President Putin has understood that he can negotiate sanction lifting on other matters outside of climate policy if Putin is able to really sort of demonstrate climate leadership.
So a lot of these countries, China, India, Brazil, sort of are saying that they still have a lot of economic growth that they want to do to elevate their people into the middle class and to grow as world economic powers. And they're all sort of saying that we need the space to use things like coal and other very polluting energy inputs to their economy in order to do that. And I guess I'm wondering whether you think that that's a reasonable position to take, that they need the time and the ability to add carbon to the atmosphere, even understanding that climate change is a huge problem in order to do this, or whether we've already passed a tipping point where the economic models of some of these countries are really just need to be thrown out altogether.
So according to the Climate Action Tracker, we have used, we are now left with about 14% of the global carbon stock that we can use up to 2050 in order to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius increase compared to pre-industrial levels in terms of temperatures. As part of these 14%, you have a lot of countries with very different levels of economic development, which is indeed causing a number of innovating companies to produce at cheaper costs and to try and export at cheaper prices. So what we're going to have to see is essentially, this transition from there is a conversation that needs to happen at a political level. That's the part which is about trying to generate this trust and credibility, particularly for the countries that are trying to spearhead climate transitions and show leadership. And there is a conversation which is about the technical aspects, the economic aspects of the transition, and how to switch to renewable sources. Knowing that on top of it, there are some countries that are, energy mixes, or it's a complicated conversation. You can't install, solar farms everywhere in the world. You can't install wind turbines everywhere in the world. You need to have the right meteorological conditions for that, the right type of power grid. There's still a lot of investments and considerations that need to go into it, and to a certain extent, for countries such as India, indeed, at the moment, coal remains more accessible, more practical, cheaper. And so it's about trying to see how we can help a country like India transition through a lot of different aspects, from territorial planning to government support and capacity building to climate finance in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And it's going to be a key conversation at COP in the next 2 weeks. And, trying to create the right economic incentives as well in order to entice in countries like India to really shift towards renewables as part of a new a new economic system.
When we come back, I'll ask Olivia about the EU's important role in fighting the climate crisis and what lessons the United States can draw from their global climate leadership. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So you wrote a recent article about how much focus has been given to reducing the carbon emissions. But what aspects of the climate crisis are we overlooking besides reducing carbon?
Plenty. But I'll start by a focus that I hold particularly to heart, which is that we have planned our transitions in a way that actually pits the climate against ecology and against the environment. Let me explain. Much of the conversation has focused on what effects decarbonization is going to have on countries such as Russia or Algeria, Nigeria, all the fossil-dependent countries. A lot less focus has been given to the supply chains concerning the raw materials that we all need collectively in order to power the green and the digital transitions. And these raw materials are rare earths to start with, but they're also lithium, cobalt, and other types of materials that are now in high demand and whose demand is going to increase exponentially over the next 2 to 3 decades. China has been, for a really long time now, for a number of decades, one of the main providers of critical materials such as rare earths. And as the US and as the EU now recognize that China is more of a systemic rival within geoeconomics and governance systems, they're looking to decrease their dependency on China as one of the main providers of rare earths and other materials. So that means that they're looking elsewhere, obviously, to find those materials. In the case of the EU, Europe is one of the most resource poor continents when it comes to the transition, and it's going to go and look for those said materials in places that are very often quite fragile in terms of governance systems, and also at times actually conflict affected, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the aspect which is often overlooked as part of the transition is essentially that because of the new types of dependencies coming from supply chains for those critical materials, we're likely to actually reproduce historical patterns of power relations and power grabs that generate marginalization, that potentially generate violence and conflict, because there is now a geopolitical competition between the US, the EU, China, and other countries, which is going to center on very fragile and also climate vulnerable countries. The other aspect is an issue which is leading to a catch-22 within our transition. Not only are materials needed for the transition concentrated outside of China in conflict and fragile affected zones, they're actually also concentrated within the critical ecosystems that regulate the global climate regime. And the more we tear down those critical ecosystems because of agriculture, but also as part of our transition because of mining, the more we're likely to actually create water scarcity at the local level where mining extractives ventures happen, but also globally, because ecosystems such as the Amazon actually distribute water all the way up to the border between Texas and Mexico, up to California, up to the American Midwest. And the tearing down of the Amazon is one of the key reasons why there are so many climate disruptions also in the US. So the foreign policy aspect of any given plan within the US or the EU or China has often been very much overlooked, because the reality is that this is where geopolitical competition happens, and we don't usually like to talk about it very much. We certainly don't like to talk about the implications of it. But the problem is that if we do not talk about this, then we're likely to actually create more climate disruptions as part of our transitions. And we're certainly going to have some disastrous impacts on biodiversity, ecological integrity, and water availability worldwide. So if we do not reconcile this tension between climate and environment, we're actually likely to dig our way into the transition in a way which actually corresponds to digging our grave.
Wow. That is terrifying, but very well said. I want all the listeners to know that we'll put Olivia's article, "The EU and Climate Security Towards Ecological Diplomacy," in the show notes, and I really encourage you all to go read it. There's plenty of other great content there by folks like Richard Youngs and Heather Grabby and others, so please go check it out. Okay, so the EU is the world leader in climate change. I think that is in fighting climate change. And I think that's pretty well agreed upon. Their vanguard is the European Green Deal. You've been a little bit critical of it. So I guess I'd be curious very briefly what it is, and then what you think, where you think it falls short.
So the European Green Deal is indeed one of the most advanced blueprints when it comes to climate transitions out there, right? It's a series of different measures. So to start with, what is really interesting about how the EU is proving credible in its plan for transitioning is that it has adopted a climate law which binds it legally to become climate neutral by 2050 and to have reduced by at least 55% its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 1990 levels.
So they've got a plan, and that's at least a good step, and they've got to fill in the details a little bit. But where does it fall short?
So the part where it falls short is essentially, well, there are different aspects. There are some contradictions within the plan. An aspect of the Green Deal, which has been missing in the design, which is the foreign policy aspect. The Green Deal has been designed for Europeans, by Europeans, and, focusing on a narrative of just transition, which is about making sure that Eastern European countries or Southern European countries are not left behind within the European plan for transition. It hasn't thought through the geopolitical and geoeconomic implications of its own energy and economic transition. So that means that now that we're about 2 years into, the von der Leyen Commission, who's the president of the European of the Commission of the European Union, we are now only entering conversations about, well, what are going to be the impacts of us transitioning towards renewable energy systems on our relationship with Russia, for example, which is very complex, right? And which has depended for a long time on energy provision as a bargaining chip between the two regions. And what are going to be the impacts on countries such as Algeria, which are a lot more fragile in terms of governance systems. And then, as I was saying before, what are going to be the implications of relying on new types of supply chains or reinforced supply chains that actually come from countries that are conflict and fragile affected? Do we have the right sort of foreign policy institutions in place within the European Union in order to deal with the economic, diplomatic, and political implications of the transition? And for that, I'm not entirely sure.
I want to turn back to COP to close us out here. And I think what's true about climate change, at least from my perspective, is that it always feels disappointing. Like we're never quite making the necessary commitments for whatever reason that we need to in order to save the planet, in order to keep the planet comfortable and habitable for humanity. So I want you, if you can, to just give us what's at stake here. Not how we fix it, but if we don't take action, what are we likely to see happen over the next 20, 50 years?
Well, this is not a very pretty picture that I'm about to paint. We are still being told that our sort of milestone for fully transitioning should be 2050. The reality is that we should probably try and get there much, much earlier. And if we don't, then the world as we know it will entirely collapse. And by that, I mean, I don't know, and I don't think that anyone can know if we're talking about full extinction of human life on planet Earth, but we are certainly talking about the extinction of human civilization. The only reason why human civilization has been able to exist over the last 11,000 years is because we were living in the Holocene with stable climate conditions, which were actually unseen in the history of the planet. It enabled agricultural development, it enabled over time industrial development, and it enabled a number of different human societies, not all of them, to reach levels of extension of, like living, very comfortable human lives, and to exist and to live until well into our 80s or 90s. A number of countries are still functioning under the illusion that climate breakdown will be manageable through technology, through fiscal space, through, especially for countries that have more established governance systems, they believe that climate breakdown is something that they will be able to navigate. But it won't be, because we have built a world which is based on economic exchange. And if we have multiple crises and collapses of, food production systems, water systems, that means that we will have collapses of industrial systems, supply chains, and therefore economic resilience in many parts of the world. So the very foundation of, the global community after the Second World War will be gone.
Well, that was certainly terrifying, but I think appropriate for everyone to understand, because that's what we're facing here unless we take action on climate change. However, difficult as it may be, I'd like to try to get us out of here on something a little more positive. When I think of climate change and climate action to confront climate change, I think of folks like Greta Thunberg, young people who are inspirational and committed to the cause in a way that has elevated it. So can you just quickly talk about the impact that activists and people, not just governments, are having in the fight against climate change, and whether you think that that's enough inspiration for us to really take this on in a serious way?
So, yes, is my short answer. What is still complicated is that the world remains heavily dependent on fossil fuels. And it's not just the matter of, fossil lobbies trying to accumulate wealth. It is, energy has been the conduit for economic, social, and human development for centuries. And what is fundamentally damning on the eve or the first day of COP26 is realizing that, as Boris Johnson was saying, we're 1 minute to midnight, right? We have waited effectively until the very last minute to start speaking of effective action. So this is not particularly good news, because organizing an energy transition, and a systemic transition really, within the next decade, because we're facing the last decade of appropriate and relevant and timely action for climate change, it's rather complicated, considering that we're over 80% collectively dependent on fossil fuels. But we're reaching the right, as I was mentioning before, the right structural and economic conditions to quickly see a shift towards the uptake of renewable energy. And what is going to be even more important is essentially all the conversations that are happening and sort of creating a vessel for the energy transition to happen, once again, in a way that is just. And on this, the fact that, we're seeing it today, right? Like, there are a number of young activists who are taking center stage at COP26. And, the Greta Thunberg and a number of her colleagues and friends, as part of the Friday for Future movement, have been instrumental in really pushing a vision which is beyond the conversation about how do we define economic development? How do we define power? How do we define, the future and the way in which, comfort and good standards of living are designed? So yes, there are definitely reasons to hope. It's, as you were saying before, like the climate conversation is often quite dampening, and I often feel like a sort of Cassandra as part of many conversations. But I also want us to focus on the part which is about the opportunity. And the opportunity is indeed to create a world in which we step out progressively of extractive economics that themselves reinforce predatory politics, and which themselves actually reinforce and strengthen geopolitical competition and therefore instability. This is what we need to find our way through and out very quickly over the next few years.
Olivia, thank you so much, and thanks for coming on the show.
My very best pleasure. I hope we'll do it again very soon.
Have a great time at COP26,
Thank
and
you.
we'll get the follow-up when you're back. Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.